Hello and welcome to our next training in this series. This training will focus on 10 steps to writing a UPR stakeholder report. This is a series of trainings that the Advocates for Human Rights is preparing for members of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty who want to hone their skills and build their capacity to engage with the United Nations to work toward abolition of the death penalty. My name is Amy Berquist. I am a senior staff attorney with the International Justice Program at the Advocates for Human Rights. The Advocates is a member of the steering committee of the World Coalition. In that capacity, we frequently collaborate with members of the coalition on UN advocacy and other activities. I'm also a vice president of the World Coalition. Elizabeth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Lacey. I'm the Program Associate for International Justice and also Women's Human Rights at the Advocates.
Here's our agenda for this training. You'll see first we'll do an overview of Universal Periodic Review stakeholder reports. Then we'll talk about 10 steps to writing a stakeholder report. We'll give you some guidance about finding documents relevant to the Universal Periodic Review, and we'll talk about some general principles and good practices for your reporting. So that's what we'll be covering today. So first, for that overview of UPR stakeholder reports. This cycle screen you've probably seen in one of our other trainings. This is the Universal Periodic Review cycle with identified in the middle various opportunities for NGO or non-governmental organization involvement. And the stakeholder reports occur at stage 1 of the process where we're preparing information for the Universal Periodic Review. And you see one of the pieces of information, or one of the sources of information for the review, is the stakeholder reports. And so those stakeholder reports are prepared fairly early on in the process, usually about 6 to 7 months before the interactive dialogue. And that's a great opportunity for civil society organizations to contribute information that can then be used in the interactive dialogue to support recommendations that the state party will then have the chance to accept or note and then subsequently implement. So that's sort of where these stakeholder reports fall in the cycle of the Universal Periodic Review. Stakeholder reports. So it's important to sort of see where the stakeholder reports fit into the bigger picture of the UPR cycle. And remember that in the interactive dialogue, governments of all countries can participate and can make a brief intervention, making a statement to the government of the state that's being reviewed. And during that interactive dialogue, the governments often make recommendations to the state under review. So they'll say, you're doing a great job with this, we're concerned about these particular issues, and we recommend that you do the following things. And they really need to utter those magic words, recommend, in order for it to count as a recommendation. So sometimes there are some weird technicalities where something doesn't count as a recommendation because the person reading the statement didn't say recommend. But if they say recommend, then that goes into the list of recommendations that the state party then has to take a look at and make a decision about. And your goal in the stakeholder reports is to influence those recommendations that are made during the interactive dialogue. So you always want to be thinking about the long game. Your purpose is to persuade the governments of the world to make particular recommendations to your government. That's what your goal is. And so everything you put into that stakeholder report should be relevant to those recommendations you want them to make. And keep in mind that the recommendations are part of a very brief statement, because any government in the world can speak during that 3.5-hour period of the interactive dialogue. The states generally have maybe 55 seconds to 2 minutes maximum for their entire statement. And because they're diplomats, they tend to waste a lot of that time saying diplomatic niceties, like we congratulate the government of Sudan for its participation in the interactive process and for its thorough report and so on. So they don't have a lot of time to dedicate to lengthy recommendations. That's something to keep in mind as well for your stakeholder reports. You don't necessarily need to go into a great level of detail because the speakers themselves won't be able to go into a lot of detail when they make their interventions. There's several key documents, and later in this training, we'll show you how to find them. The first key document is the report of the working group from the previous Universal Periodic Review. This is a cyclical process, and so the first purpose of any Universal Periodic Review is to assess what has happened since the last time around. So you want to look at what the recommendations were that were made to the state under review during the last UPR. And you'll also want to pay careful attention to whether those recommendations were accepted or noted. And a reminder that noted at the UN means rejected. The response of the state party to those recommendations will either be contained in the report of the working group itself, in which case the recommendations are clustered into a list of recommendations that enjoy the support of the state party and other recommendations that are noted. You may also see in the report of the working group that some or all of the recommendations the state party decided to defer decision on. So they will, it'll say that they will inform the Human Rights Council in due course, no later than the next session of the Human Rights Council. If the government decided to wait and take their time to look over carefully the recommendations and make a decision, then typically the formal responses come in a separate document called an addendum. And the addendum might just list the recommendations by number and say accepted, noted. It might also give some explanation for why they are accepting or noting particular recommendations, or it might give some sense that they are accepting a recommendation because they believe it's already being implemented or has already been implemented, which can be the case in some circumstances. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, pretty close to the deadline for UPR stakeholder reports, also publishes a matrix, which can be very helpful because it organizes recommendations thematically from the previous Universal Periodic Review. So that can be a good way to sort of organize your thoughts on particular topics. Some countries have made commitments to submit a midterm report to the Human Rights Council at about the midpoint of the UPR cycle. So if there is such a report, you'll want to look at that. And other key documents that aren't directly on point for the Universal Periodic Review, but are also still relevant, are the most recent concluding observations from treaty bodies, because you may want to incorporate those concluding observations into your suggested recommendations, for example, as an efficient way to get a detailed, strong recommendation made during those precious seconds when the delegates to the Human Rights Council are speaking. Our audience. Now, bear in mind that the people you most want to read your stakeholder report and take up your recommendations are busy diplomats. These are the people who are taking up the recommendations and speaking on the floor of the Human Rights Council. They do everything related to human rights. So they're not a specialist in your particular country. They're typically not specialists in the death penalty or detention conditions. They're very busy. They don't have time to read a lengthy report. And so in many cases, less is more. You don't have to go into a lot of detail. You need to focus on key recommendations and then provide the factual evidence, the information that proves your point about why that would be a good recommendation, why that would be helpful to you and helpful to advance the cause of abolition in your country. Now, there are secondary audiences as well, the general public. You're going to all of this trouble to write a stakeholder report, and you may want to disseminate it to the public to use it as an educational and awareness raising tool. So keep that in mind as well. Another audience is the staff of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. One of the things the staff do is, after all the stakeholder reports are submitted, the staff compile a summary report that includes references to all of the reports that are submitted. And it's typically a 10 to 12-page report that gives just a really top-level overview of all the human rights issues that were presented in all of the different stakeholder reports for a country. So you want to make sure that the staff will be able to incorporate your information into their summary document as well, because that will help highlight your issues. Another audience might be your own government. Your own government may want to read the report, see what you're saying about them, and perhaps use that as information that may guide its decision-making process as well. There are, I feel I should say, these documents are always public, and some of our partners have concerns about their names, the names of their organizations being included as stakeholders in the stakeholder report because they're concerned about reprisals. And in some contexts, that's a very legitimate concern. The Advocates for Human Rights and the World Coalition are happy to to submit a report without your organization's name on it, if that makes sense, if that would make your condition more safe and secure. So feel free to communicate with us about what the circumstances are and what would be best. In other other contexts, our partner organizations on the ground say that it would be better if international organizations' names are not on the stakeholder report, if it's just their organization, and we're happy to do that as well. If we're collaborating with you, we'll put you in the driver's seat, and you can tell us what will be best for your context. The look back period for your report. Now, some people might start from the very beginning when the death penalty was introduced in their country and how many executions there have been since that period of time. But for purposes of a UPR stakeholder report, you really want to focus on the period of time since the last interactive dialogue. Because it's a cyclical process, you're not going to look back to a previous cycle. You're just going to look at the most recent cycle that's being completed as the relevant period of time. So in terms of the information you provide in your report, it's best to stick to that, that previous 4 to 5 years. The Advocacy for Human Rights has created a template that you're welcome to use for your stakeholder reports. This is sort of a screenshot of the first page of the template. If you'd like a template such as this, you can reach out to me and I'll be happy to give that to you. If you're working with a team of our pro bono attorneys and they are assisting with drafting the report, they already have this template. But you can also create your own template, and we're happy to include your logo at the top of the stakeholder report on the first page as well. We want to make sure that you're getting as much publicity as you would like in the process. Next, I'll hand over to Elizabeth to start our discussion of how to write a stakeholder report. And this is a detailed process, and I will be chiming in as well as we go through the process of writing a stakeholder report.
Thanks, Amy. All right, so how do you go about writing a UPR stakeholder report? Well, there are 10 steps that we have to guide you, broken up into 3 phases. So the first phase is setting the stage, then planning and gathering information, and implementation. There are also some best practices and things to avoid that we'll talk about later in the presentation. Next slide. So before you start the report writing process, it's important to know the basic rules. You can find the UPR Stakeholder Report Technical Guidelines by visiting the OHCHR website. It's ohchr.org, and clicking on Universal Periodic Review. You'll then click on Civil Society Engagement on the left-hand side of the page, as you can see, where you can scroll down to find a link to the technical guidelines. We'll go through a few of the most important points in the next few slides. So first, it's important to know the format of UPR stakeholder reports when you submit them. You should submit the report in Microsoft Word format with a cover page that includes the name of your organization, a short description of the work your organization does, and a logo if you have one. This page should also include a logo and description for your partner organizations or sign-ons if they agree to include their logo. You can see an example of a cover page in any of the Advocate stakeholder reports or in the template page that Amy showed in the previous slide. You should also pay attention to the length of the report. It should be no more than 2,815 words for an individual submission, which I think is how many pages, Amy?
I think it's approximately 10.
Okay. And then for 5,630 words for a joint submission, which I think is approximately 15. So as you can see, it is to your advantage to submit a report with other sign-on organizations because you get a little bit more room to submit your information.
Twice as much, in fact.
Yes.
And it's important to add here that when counting words, the word count does not include the end notes, and we'll be talking about the end notes in just a moment. It also doesn't include the cover page. So typically what I will do is just select and highlight the text in the body of the report and do the word count of that to see whether I'm getting close to the word limit. Anything more before we move on, Elizabeth?
Nope, I think that's it. So you'll also want to number all of the pages and the paragraphs so that delegates or anyone else is able to easily consult and reference the stakeholder report. That would also be important for the staff at OHCHR to pull together the summary. Finally, use endnotes rather than footnotes. And as Amy just said, the endnotes are not part of the word count, but you should not include any substantive information in the endnotes because, as we said, these diplomats are pretty busy and they're not going to be looking in your endnotes most likely for substantive information.
And that same goes for the OHCHR staff who are busy compiling all of these stakeholder reports. They basically said they won't read your endnotes. So you should have them to prove that there are sources for all of your claims, but don't rely on them to be reading them for their substance.
Great. All right, on to the substance of the report. So generally, stakeholder reports can be divided into 3 sections: a procedural section, section describing what has happened since the last UPR, and a recommendations section. So for the procedural section, the technical guidelines ask that you include the implementation of recommendations from previous UPR cycles. So this means you'll need to find the document called the Report of the Working Group from the last UPR review and identify relevant recommendations your country received. We will talk more about that process in finding the documents section of the later in the presentation. Once you've identified the relevant recommendations, you can evaluate the status of implementation by saying whether it has been fully implemented, partially implemented, in the process of implementation, or not implemented yet. You also have the option of including a matrix or a list of recommendations organized by theme as an annex, which will not be included in the word count. The advocates generally include recommendations in the endnotes, which is another option and also won't be counted in the word count. In the second section of the report, include any regressive actions since the last UPR, like a country that has established a moratorium on the death penalty but talks about renewing executions. Also include any progress the country has made toward implementing UPR recommendations, such as any new legislation that's been passed. Finally, include any other significant developments that have occurred, such as political uprisings or changes of power. Anything to add to that, Amy?
No, that's great.
All right. So more on the substance, a few more highlights from the technical guidelines to pay attention to. First, you should include only credible and reliable information on the human rights situation in the state under review, which basically means you'll need to ensure you're using either firsthand information on the ground with permission or credible secondary sources. You should also highlight main human rights issues of concern, so stick to what you know rather than including a broad range of issues. The scope of the report, as Amy talked about, should be limited to the period since the last review. So that's usually about 4.5 years prior to the session where the government will be under review. So limit your report to information from the past 4.5 years. The technical guidelines also ask you not to use abusive language. Now, what does abusive language mean? Generally, it means language that is accusatory or incendiary, which can lessen the credibility of the report. You should try to use neutral, objective, non-adversarial language and tone to maintain your own credibility and to ensure that the report is considered. Unfortunately, a report that is not considered objective or that is considered overtly political may not be taken seriously because of the perception that the information it contains is not credible. A report might lose credibility when it includes emotions and subjective opinions, so it's critical to take care in the drafting and editing stages. Finally, as we mentioned before, joint submissions are encouraged, but it's better to partner with an organization that works on similar issues so that you can narrow your focus.
And I'll add there that some of our partner organizations will participate in the creation of several stakeholder reports. So they might work with the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty and the Advocates for Human Rights on a report that focuses exclusively on the death penalty and related issues like detention condition, but they might also participate in a broader civil society report that covers a wider range of issues, and they'll contribute just where their expertise is. So it's fine to do that. That gives you multiple opportunities to engage in your advocacy and to have an audience for it.
Great. All right, a few more notes on substance. You should prioritize firsthand information as much as you can, and any findings your organization has on the ground. So for instance, the Advocates is an organization serving asylum seekers in the United States, and therefore our clients have important firsthand information that we can incorporate into the report, so we should prioritize that. You should only include secondhand information if necessary, so to corroborate that firsthand information. And in your recommendations section, you should offer SMART recommendations, which Amy talked about in a previous presentation in this series. It's also important to link your recommendations to the themes you lay out in the rest of the report. So always provide a proposed solution to problems that you highlight in the body of the report. And finally, you can leave out a list of ratified treaties or text of concluding observations from human rights treaty bodies. In general, you should stick to the UPR mechanism for these reports unless it's really relevant to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'll add with respect to themes, the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights has come up with a long list. I think it's more than 40 different human rights topics that come up in stakeholder reports. And so if you look at our template, we've included all of those potential themes as possible subcategories you can use. So the death penalty is one of those, and that's pretty obvious. So you would just reference that theme. But there are also separate themes on detention conditions, use of torture, fair trial and due process rights. So if you can replicate the same theme titles that the OHCHR staff are used to seeing, that will make it easier for them to take your report and include it into their summary report as well.
Great, thanks. All right, so a quick note on confidentiality. As Amy mentioned before, it's important to keep in mind that your identity as a stakeholder is public, and any sign-on organizations as well. And it will also be published on the UN website. Stakeholders, however, can keep their sources confidential. As I mentioned in the previous slide, you might be using firsthand information from clients or individuals who directly experienced human rights violations. So it's important to weigh the risks when including individual cases and to ensure that their information remains anonymous and that you gain permission from them directly to use that information. You can contact OHCHR at reprisals@ohchr.org if intimidation or reprisals occur against human rights defenders or individuals following submission of a stakeholder report.
And I'll add that OHCHR takes reprisals very seriously. They really do want to hear if you or people affiliated with your stakeholder report are facing repercussions for engaging in advocacy with the United Nations. The same is true with any advocacy with the treaty bodies. They do want to hear about it. Of course, the best option is to avoid reprisals in the first place, so we can work together on doing that. But if in the end reprisals happen, please let us know, and please let the OHCHR know that those reprisals have happened. They will often issue a stern warning to the government of the state under review and let them know that they're sort of on notice, that the UN is aware that reprisals are happening and is dissatisfied with that. And sometimes that's actually quite effective in getting the reprisals to stop.
All right, finally to step one. To writing a stakeholder report, and the first step of the first phase, setting the stage. So first you'll want to identify your expertise as well as your partner organization's issues. So evaluate which issues your organization can speak about best and what outcomes you advocate for. This will help you narrow the focus of your report. You'll also want to identify what your advocacy goals are, which we'll talk about more in step 6. Do you want to publicize your report and use it to educate the public, lobby delegates? You should also identify the resources available to you. So do you know experts who can research your issues? Do you know individuals who have directly experienced human rights violations or who work with people who have experienced human rights violations? Identify this network and contact them early in the process, as it can take a little longer than you think. All right, step 2, identify your allies. So you should identify any allies who could collaborate on a joint stakeholder report or sign on to a report that you yourself prepare. So these allies may come in the form of other NGOs or research institutions such as universities. I think the Advocates has collaborated before with U of M, the University of Minnesota, with a team of students. As we mentioned before, there is power in numbers. So for one thing, you get to submit a longer report, but a single stakeholder report supported by a large alliance or a collection of stakeholder reports submitted by a broader network is more powerful than scattered submissions. So keep that in mind. All right, step 3, identify the rights. So the Universal Periodic Review is a charter-based mechanism, meaning it derives its power from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or the UN Charter. So you'll want to identify which articles of the UDHR are most relevant to your issues and make a connection between those rights and the work you do. You can also look at voluntary pledges or commitments, including those undertaken when presenting candidature or election to the Human Rights Council. You can find a list on the OHCHR website under Human Rights Council elections. Finally, you may want to search for applicable international humanitarian law, which Amy can talk a little bit more about.
Sure. So while the Universal Periodic Review is a mechanism that focuses on human rights, there are issues of humanitarian law that have to do with the law of war and armed conflict that are applicable and relevant, and you often hear recommendations that reference humanitarian law principles and international humanitarian law standards as well. So that's completely fair game. The Universal Periodic Review is very broad, and so anything that has a connection to human rights is relevant.
Great. So this next part of step 3 is not required, but might be interesting to look into. So you can take a look at treaty language to see how treaty bodies have interpreted these rights that you're focusing on. So if you're focusing on the death penalty, for instance, you might want to take a look at the language in the second optional protocol to the ICCPR. Also look at general comments to see if any treaty bodies have said anything to clarify these rights. The treaty body's concluding observations for the state under review might also be helpful. And you can even look at treaties the country hasn't ratified.
Yeah, and this is a great opportunity, especially for countries that haven't ratified some of the key human rights treaties. The UPR is your opportunity to encourage them to ratify those treaties. So this is your chance if you're in the United States, which hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The UPR is your real big chance to advocate for that ratification. So that's certainly fair game. And as I said, it's a very broad approach to human rights. So almost anything is potentially relevant for your UPR stakeholder report.
All right, on to step 4, reviewing the procedural history. So at this stage, you should look at what happened at the last UPR. So as you know by now, at the last interactive dialogue, the country will have received several recommendations from other delegations at the UN review, UPR. So you'll want to find recommendations that relate to the issues and rights you identified in steps 1 through 3, again, in the report of the working group. And that's a place where they've compiled all of the recommendations for you. So then you'll want to see whether the state accepted or rejected those recommendations, either in the report of the working group itself or in the addendum. So again, that depends, as Amy said, on whether the government has chosen to reply in the next few days or at the next Human Rights Council session. Finally, you can consult the matrix of recommendations divided by theme to find recommendations related to your issues. I would recommend reading through the report of the working group initially rather than just the matrix, partly because it's published earlier, but also some of your own issues may not be fully captured in the matrix because they might divide it up differently. In addition to the last UPR review, you might want to read up on what has happened with other human rights mechanisms. So you may want to focus on specific treaty bodies that relate to your issues. For instance, if your report focuses on women's rights, you may want to consult the concluding observations or lists of issues from the last review by the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. All right, step 5, clarify your role. And this is moving on to planning and gathering information. So you'll want to clarify your role along with the role of your partner organizations. So that means you want to think about these questions. How can you shed more light on the rights identified in step 3, what the government has done to implement recommendations from the last UPR, other developments since the last UPR, and related issues? So you might have on-the-ground information from the work you do, firsthand accounts about rights being denied, including the voices of victims whose rights have been violated, advocates who work with them, and witnesses to these violations. You might also have information from reports your organization has written or other specialized knowledge. Anything else to add there, Amy? All right, so for step 6, you want to set your goals. After you've clarified your role, it's important to set your advocacy goals, as we talked about. So think about what you want delegates to say on your behalf about the issues you care about. There are three main ways to engage. First, you can lobby delegates to ask questions of the government's delegation in advance of the review. Delegates can also make recommendations to the government under review during the interactive dialogue about how it should better promote human rights and monitor human rights conditions. Sharing suggested recommendations with delegates can influence the recommendations they ultimately make to the government under review. Consult with your partner organizations early about priority recommendations as well.
And I'll add that some of you may be the partner organizations. And
Yes.
if you're working with the Advocates for Human Rights and the World Coalition on a stakeholder report, that's going to be the first thing that we and our pro bono attorneys are eager to hear from you is what are your priorities out for the UPR? What recommendations would be most helpful for you to see coming out of the process?
Great. So here are a couple of examples of questions submitted in advance. So what are the reasons for the sudden and all-encompassing wave of searches on NGOs, including the scope of these inspections on the criteria used to determine which organizations should be subjected to inspection? So that's a pretty specific question. And as you can tell, it's also, rather than being future-oriented, it's retrospective and measurable, similar to our SMART recommendations. So it's a little bit similar to the list of issues process in the treaty body mechanism. All right, step 7, make and implement a work plan. So here's where you will connect steps 5 and 6 and begin the process of gathering information. So take the information in step 5 and think about how it will help you achieve the goals set out in step 6, your advocacy goals. So prioritize firsthand information as the technical guidelines asked, such as interviews with victims or advocates working with victims. Be sure that you keep track of your sources and gain permission from all the victims, advocates, or witnesses. That's really crucial. Corroborate that information with credible secondary sources as well. So these include credible news platforms or international sources such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. Think about how you can ensure that the information you gather is credible, relevant, and up to date. You can also take steps to use the report as an organizing opportunity in your community after you submit it. That might include a communications plan to promote the report on social media, or a plan to follow the UN review process. On to step 8, writing the report. So you'll need to set up a writing team. This might be one or more people depending on the complexity of the report. But you'll want to connect the rights laid out in step 4 with the information gathered in step 7. Incorporate proposed recommendations, including priority recommendations from step 6. You may need to revise them based on what ends up in the report. Remember to connect your recommendations back to the themes in section 2 and the themes that Amy mentioned, and don't use abusive language. You also don't need to discuss the procedural history from concluding observations, treaty ratifications, etc., but you may be including that as far as step 3 in identifying the rights. Okay, step 9, finalizing and submitting the report. So once you've finished the report, how do you submit it? You can check the deadline for submission by consulting the Advocates online deadline database. And once you finalize the report, there's an online UPR registration system that's fairly easy to use once you've registered. So you can see on this page, UPR documentation on the left there, you can click register. The deadline for submission is 3 p.m. Geneva time, so you'll need to figure out what time that is in your time zone. And the deadline is pretty strict because it's an automated system. So you'll want to upload the cover page with your organization's information as a separate document from the body of the report and upload any annexes separately. So that helps them to count the words. The UPR Submissions Help Desk can answer questions you have during the process.
And I'll add that if you're collaborating with the World Coalition and the Advocates for Human Rights, the Advocates for Human Rights is happy to handle the upload process. But if you would like to do it to build your capacity, you can certainly let us know, and we're happy to have that happen. All
right, on to step 10, which is arguably one of the most important, advocate. So now that you've written your report, it's time to promote it. There are many different opportunities to advocate during the UPR process, as we've talked about. You can encourage a targeted list of diplomats to ask questions. and/or make priority recommendations. You can advocate to persuade the government itself to accept certain recommendations, or advocate for implementation of recommendations following the review process. You can also use your report as a valuable tool for promoting social justice in the longer term. For instance, you can engage in education and outreach within your organization to the public or to the media. So you could draft a press release about your report, a blog post, or a press release about the UPR review process and the outcomes. If you have a website, publish your report there. In general, work with your organization and other stakeholders to develop and implement strategies to use your report to promote justice in your community. And I would say the Advocates is available for consultation on that as well.
Yeah, and some of our coalition partners have also held press conferences to announce or launch the release of their report to get more attention toward it. They might do it as soon as they submit it, or they might wait until closer to the interactive dialogue itself as a way to introduce to the media and to the general public the report that they submitted. So next we'll talk about how to find those UPR documents that Elizabeth mentioned, and we'll just show you a few screenshots for how to navigate the UN websites. And the UN websites are not particularly easy to navigate, but hopefully these screenshots and instructions will help you find your way. You should be able to go to the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights main website and find the Universal Periodic Review. And then you'll find most or all of the key documents under the heading Documentation by Country. And so if you click that link, it will give you a list of all of the countries in the world. And then you select the country and it will take you to a page that's specific to that country and its UPRs. So you'll see, this is an example for Jamaica. And it tells you when it'll start with the most recent cycle, and then if you scroll down, you'll see the older cycles. So this is where you would find the information about the previous cycle of the Universal Periodic Review when the interactive dialogue happened. It will give you access to the national report, which is the report the government submits. It's sort of self-audit about its implementation of human rights obligations in the previous 5 years. Then you'll see the compilation of UN information. That's a summary of the different treaty bodies and other UN bodies, things that they have said about human rights in the particular country. And then the document we've referenced before, the summary of stakeholders' information. This is the report prepared by OHCHR staff. It's usually about 10 pages, and it summarizes all of the different stakeholder reports that were submitted for that particular UPR for that particular country. You'll see the little footnote 3, and that's a very useful one if you want to go back and look at the different specific stakeholder reports and not just read the summary. If you click the 3, you'll get the full list of all the stakeholder reports that were submitted for that country for that UPR cycle. You can also see what questions were submitted in advance, and most relevant for purposes of preparing your forthcoming stakeholder report, you can find the report of the working group and the addendum that Elizabeth mentioned. So those documents are available on that page. If you scroll down, the report of the working group will include a list of all of the recommendations that were made. It will also include a summary of the interactive dialogue more generally, things the state parties said about a variety of issues during that interactive dialogue. That can be really helpful to assess what did your government say about the death penalty during the last UPR? What was sort of the position that they presented formally to the Human Rights Council about the death penalty? That might give you ideas of recommendations you'd want to make in the future. So if your country said, we retain the death penalty because the public supports the death penalty, then you might want to think about pressing for a recommendation that calls on the government to educate the public about the death penalty and alternatives to the death penalty and human rights concerns about the death penalty. Or even to ask the government to collaborate with civil society organizations about engaging in a public awareness raising campaign. Because if the government is saying it's relying on public opinion, then the government should want public opinion to be well informed. So that might be a good strategic recommendation to think about if the government's position is the public wants the death penalty, we have to keep it. So you can take a look at the report of the working group for that information, as well as the list of all the recommendations that were made. And then the addendum, if there is one, that will give the government's response to those recommendations so you can know whether they were accepted or noted. General principles. We have a few general principles to cover with respect to good practices for UPR stakeholder reports. If you take a look at this, it tells you some best practices include framing each issue. So use your recommendations, your suggested, what you want the delegates to the Human Rights Council to recommend, and frame your arguments and organize your report around those recommendations. So let the recommendations be your guiding star. Focus on those first, what you want to see come out of the interactive dialogue, and then load your information and focus in your report to justify those recommendations. Another good way to frame the issues is to say, here's what the government's position is, or here's what the law in our country says, and then give an explanation of here's what's actually going on. Because governments often like to toot their own horn, paint a rosy picture of the human rights situation in the country, and you as people on the ground working on human rights issues can say, here are the actual problems that the government isn't telling you about. So you have a lot to offer to the Universal Periodic Review process and information to share with the Human Rights Council delegates they're not going to get from any other source. They want to hear from you so that they can make good, relevant recommendations. Another good practice for your stakeholder reports is to use examples or stories. Case studies can be really helpful to sort of drive home what the human rights problems are a country is facing. These examples might identify gaps in the law, things that the law doesn't cover that it should be covering, or barriers to implementation. If you think about, for example, detention conditions, there might be issues where people with disabilities who are being held in detention are not given reasonable accommodations, and there might be some barriers to those reasonable accommodations that could be overcome by a recommendation. So, for example, if they are being denied access to medication that they need for purposes of their disability, then there could be a recommendation to ensure that healthcare providers in detention conditions allow people who are detained full access to any medications that they need for purposes of their disability. So a relatively simple recommendation that would overcome this barrier to ensuring reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. Best practices include using endnotes, as Elizabeth said, and those endnotes should show where your information is coming from. So they should be a way to prove to yourself and to the world that you're not just making this up. You have sources for every claim that you're making. Now, it might be that you received information from an email or from an interview with someone. You can still include that as a footnote to document where you got that information. If your source wants to remain anonymous, you can do that. You can, but still keep the end note and say interview with anonymous source on this particular date via, in person or via Skype or however you did the interview. It's still a way to formally document where you received that information. It makes your report much more credible. Things to avoid: a lengthy procedural history. These busy diplomats don't care about the procedural history. They want to know briefly what happened. What were the recommendations the last time around? Were they accepted or noted? Have they been implemented? But they don't want a lot of time. They don't want to spend a lot of time reading that. Also, don't engage in a lengthy discussion of the substance of particular rights. So we know that Article 6 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has to do with the right to life. You don't need to go into a lot of detail about what the right to life means with respect to the death penalty. What you really want to spend your focus your attention on in your report is what's going on the ground. So you don't need to go into a lot of theoretical discussion about what these rights mean. You want to show what's happening in your country. You don't need lengthy legal analysis. You don't need to be citing court cases or specific treaty language typically. Also avoid the tone of a legal brief. You want to be presenting the facts. You want to be presenting credible information about what's happening on the ground. So you don't need to include a lot of legal discussion and terminology. Also, it's good to avoid vague recommendations. If you have already watched the video training on SMART recommendations, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I urge you to watch that next. A good practice is to focus on making SMART recommendations that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. And you may see, if you read the report of the working group, that not all of the recommendations are SMART. You might see a lot of vague recommendations and recommendations that don't really help, like consider imposing a moratorium on the death penalty. And that's very easy for a government to accept because in this case, well, we considered it and we decided not to do it. So that doesn't help anything. But That's the choice of the government to make a weak recommendation. As advocates, as civil society organizations, we always want to give them smart recommendations. And if they choose to water them down, that's their choice, but we're not going to help them in that process. So that's the end of our training. You'll see up on the screen my email address and telephone number. You'll also see, as we've referenced before in previous trainings, our toolkit, Human Rights Tools for a Changing World, and Chapter 9 that focuses on advocacy at the United Nations. That's another good resource for you if you want to learn more about these United Nations mechanisms. So we hope that you found this training to be useful and informative. If you have follow-up questions, please let us know. And we hope to be able to have the opportunity to collaborate with you on writing a stakeholder report, taking you through this process. And we hope it will build your capacity to be able to engage effectively with the United Nations human rights mechanisms, in particular with the Universal Periodic Review. So thanks very much for your attention, and we hope to see you again next time.